Absolutely. And with, hard seltzers like White Claw, who are drinking wine's lunch, if you will, I think we do need multiple points of contact and influence wherever it can be found, if the wine category is going to continue to thrive. Um, let's talk about the luxury category. Peter, you've written the book. Show us the book. Luxury Wine Marketing. You wrote the book literally with Dr. Liz Tosh
Hmm.
at which university does she work at?
Sonoma State.
Oh, great. So you two collaborated on this book. And so let's start off with what is a luxury wine beyond an expensive one?
Yeah, and I think that's important because I think people just think price normally when
Hmm.
they think of delineating that, and
Yeah.
price is a good shorthand for the most part, but it's not enough, right? To be a luxury product, you have to be desired, and we actually have. I probably need to read them, and I should know this by heart, but there's like we have six elements that define what a luxury wine is. So it's really high quality, of course, coming from a
Mhm.
special place. I think that's very specific for wine that the terroir and everything is unique. There's a sense of scarcity. So if it's ubiquitous, it may not be that's actually scarce, but there's at least a sense of scarcity and something that's driven by price. It has a high price, an elevated price point. It provides a sense of privilege, and I think that's true of all luxury goods, right? Where it helps you differentiate people just with that sense of privilege. You feel special for having it, enjoying it, and it provokes pleasure. So I think, that for wine is a very specific element where it gives you all sorts of pleasure, just mentally as well as physically, and it's something you can share with others.
Absolutely. That's a great definition, very holistic. Um, and when I think of luxury wines, I think of like Domaine Romani Conti, the icon Burgundian wine that probably goes for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars a bottle when it's released. But and so I tend to think that it's a very small market, the luxury wine market, but it's surprisingly larger than we think. How big is the market, Peter?
We thought it was, might be too small too. And so when we actually did the market sizing in for shorthand about $100 above, we found it was a $5 billion a year market. So it was much
Wow.
bigger than we anticipated and what other people thought it would be.
And 5 billion, is that US or worldwide?
Worldwide. Worldwide.
Worldwide. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. All
Yearly.
right.
Annual, yeah.
Yearly, annual. Wow, that's pretty huge. Robert, what's the best luxury wine that you've ever tasted, and what is the one that's on your bucket list?
Oh, I mean, I've had the luxury of tasting a lot of the years. I have not. I mean, obviously, in terms of like, I haven't had the big two from Romani Conti, Latache and Romani Conti. So those are two on my list. I've had all the other wines,
Oh, that's good.
but I haven't had that. So those two, so those are on my list. But yeah, there's always something that there's a whole wide range of wines that would be on that list in terms of that. It's always hard to pick like what's your
Sure. Do you have one from California, Robert? Would there be one from like a cult wine from California that you'd love to try,
Or that you've had.
or that you've
yeah,
had?
I mean I've
Yeah.
had most of them. Yeah, I mean I can get access to those if I need them. But yeah, it's not there's nothing that I'm like dying to try and haven't had. So yeah, being
I,
in California, it's a little easier to get those than that's those other
Yeah,
ones.
they're in your backyard, so to speak.
I really remember trying at I guess the winery or at the Abbey. I had a tasting with Dom Perignon and the
Oh,
winemaker at the time
in Champagne.
in Champagne, and
Yeah.
so we had the last five vintages I think of the regular wine, and then two P2s, and then a P3, which was the 73, I believe.
Why did they call it P3? Oh, is it Perignon, shorthand for?
No,
Oh,
plentitude.
oh,
Plentitude. So
Plenitude.
it's aged in the bottle certainly longer, so they keep some stock aging from that vintage, and then they're tasting it all the time. And when it hits what they consider Richard Geoffroy at the time, he's
What does
since
that mean?
retired.
Richard? Oh, that was the
He's the
name.
winemaker,
Okay,
or was the
gotcha.
winemaker.
Yeah.
When they taste and then it hits that next level of quality, I guess, or the next expression, they call
Okay.
it plentitude, and then they bottle a
Oh,
bunch and they
wow.
sell it for a lot more money, and then they wait again, and when it hits that next level again, and so it's not just the same wine aged longer. Like that
Huh.
was already bottled or disgorged and aged longer. It was aged on lees for decades, and the P3 was incredibly fresh and vibrant and just it was amazing. There was all these sort of tropical citrus and other things that you don't normally get out of champagne, and that was if I scored wine and said it was like that would be 100 point wine for me.
Wow. Wow, that sounds beautiful. And so P3, so is it from a certain vintage or just
Hmm.
as it ages?
It
Okay.
was from a certain, so it was like I believe the 73 vintage. I have it in
Okay.
my notes
Wow.
somewhere.
Yeah.
And and this was 3 or 4 years ago, maybe like 2018, I think, or
Okay.
no, probably 2017. And
Wow.
so, um, yeah, it had been aging all that time and was just recently disgorged. And so, like late disgorged, this is like very late disgorged.
Yeah, decades later. Wow. And the lees, just for anyone who might be listening and isn't sure what those are, those are the spent or the dead yeast cells, but it gives it a very creamy, rich texture when wine is aged on the lees. Um, and so, like, approximately, I know, like, can't nail it, but Dom Perignon itself, the sort of, I can't even say basic Dom Perignon, that's an oxymoron, but when it's released, is it about $300 a bottle ish?
In the
Or,
US, I think it's around 175 or so.
okay, I
Yeah.
must be thinking Canadian dollars then. That would
Yeah.
make sense. And then a plenitude, like, how much more would that be? And
Five,
a
six hundred
second and a
dollars.
third?
So the P2s are usually in the $300 to $400 range, and the
Okay.
P3s are usually 1,000 plus. A
Yeah.
thousand could
Wow.
be like 2 or 3 thousand, because that's
Holy smokes.
literally decades in very small production.
Wow. And what makes Dom Perignon such a great luxury brand, apart from, it's really expensive and it's really great, so quality and price are there, but what is it about that brand that really works for it?
Well, I think one of the things that's very distinctive about it and how it's amazing is that how big it is.
Huh. Uh,
Everyone has heard of it,
yes.
one, and then two, it's like it is, I think, the largest produced luxury wine in the world. When they make wine, which isn't every year, but almost every year, like 5 million bottles of it. So
Holy
champagne has like
smokes.
littered with underground cellars of Dom Perignon in it. But and even at
Wow.
that production level, it's able to have maintained its status, its scarcity, and its quality. We just talked about how good the wines are, right?
Yeah.
And so even collectors, like semi collectors, Robert's more of a collector than me, maybe a semi collector, still cherish and value that wine and that brand. So to have been able to establish such a success, keep that story there, keep some, prestige, keep the prestige of the brand while having expanded. It's, versus like Krug is, even though it's in the same house, they're all owned by LVMH, is much, much smaller. It's, 20,000 cases, I think, versus like a few hundred. It's like 10 times smaller than Dom Perignon.
Wow. And it's what is the LVMH? It's Louis
Louis
Vuitton,
Vuitton,
Moet
Moet
Hennessy.
Hennessy. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So
All
they
the
own
luxury
everything
brands.
from Louis Vuitton to Sephora to, Colgan Cellars and Napa to a bunch of champagne houses, including Moet and Chandon and Dom Perignon and Krug,
Huh.
and some of the other top wines of the world.
That is amazing. And I guess it's the story as well of the monk, Dom Perignon. What's true and what's not true? He was a blind monk Benedictine, is it?
Yeah, and he was probably influential in establishing how champagne is made,
Hmm.
but he didn't necessarily invent it, and I don't think his name was necessarily that big back then. But that's sort of the beauty of the storytelling, right? He's become this
Yeah,
mythical,
Champagne
bigger
Santa
than
Claus.
life figure that
it's
who, when
true.
he was alive, probably was just like a pretty good winemaker.
Yeah, that's true. I think you've written about this, Peter, but I'd love to hear Robert's take. But I think sometimes the story is as important as the brand, and especially if there's an element of struggle. Perhaps for him, it's maintaining his vows and making the best wine he can, but there's also a rags to riches story that can come with these brands too, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the story is so critical. When I worked and helped manage Costa Brown Winery in Sonoma, that the story of the founders who saved their tip money right in a tip jar every day working at a restaurant in
Mm.
Santa Rosa to start their passion project of Pinot Noir and wine to, having now sold it a couple times, but becoming one of the more, I think, iconic names in California Pinot Noir
Right.
is certainly, you could have rags to riches stories in wine.
Huh. So, Robert, Peter's talked about 4 categories of luxury wine buyers. In which of those categories would you place yourself when you do buy a luxury wine?
I'll
Oh,
remind him that they're
yeah, thank
the luxury wine buyer, the
Yeah,
wine collector, the wine geek, and the aspirational buyer.
there you go.
yeah, probably being the wine geek or aspirational buyer.
And
You know,
tell us
I don't.
about those, Robert. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I will spend money on wine, and I kind of hunt. I never buy things in cases. If I really, I'll buy one-offs, but I'll usually buy multiple things from a producer just to sort of understand their style, see if I like it, maybe even a couple of vintages, in one-off bottles. And if I start to like it, I will, and think it would be interesting to collect. I would be buy three. My magic number is like I can drink one early on, and I can chicken onto one. And if it was too early, I could hold one back. So that's like my magic number of buying things, if I really
Hmm.
like it. And as I've gotten older, I'm basically buying less things but better things.
Yeah.
So I'm always kind of looking because I can't afford to buy. I don't have the DRC or Roumier or allocation. So I'm kind of looking for that next level down, like people who are starting to get better. But at a certain point, some of those roosters are going to get expensive for me as well. I'm always kind of looking next third layer down. It's like people are on the rise. Good wines. A lot of times, this is a lot of my collecting is either on some of the high end stuff in Napa, but also a lot of Burgundy. And I always have a couple that I buy as well, just because I really love aged Bordeaux. But those are the main areas that I kind of buy things on in new releases.
I
And how
would
about
have
you,
said
Peter?
Robert was on the intersection of wine geek and wine collector. Because the
Ah,
aspirational buyer is someone who's looking up at a true luxury buyer who might be someone like LeBron James is actually pretty knowledgeable about wine, but like a celebrity or someone who's like truly wealthy, who's, just buying high end wine brands because, they know it's good, but they're not really like super into wine. And
okay.
aspirational buyers often look up to those people and they want to feel that luxury, so they'll buy, what I would call an everyday luxury wine, like $100 to $200 bottle of wine, to have a connection with that, versus the
Okay.
wine geek is like interested in all these different intricacies and different brands and regions and whatnot. And I think Robert and I both fall in that category, but I think his collection is a little better than mine, and so like I'd say he's maybe at that intersection with the collector, not a full collector who's really interested in all the scores and what's rare and things like that, but in that intersection of collector and geek.
And what motivates that collector to buy? Is it just the idea of having trophy wines in the cellar, or what's the motivation there?
Well, I think there's some people in general who just like to collect things, right? And
Hmm.
they see value in the story of having different things. Or, I mean, I probably am in that category because my mom tries to get me to get rid of this all the time. But like all the comic books that are stored at her house are like sports cards from the 80s and 90s that are worthless. But
You
like
never know. One card might make your fortune.
yeah, yeah. I've tried. I've tried to look it up to see if that was worth anything now because collectibles have gone crazy during the pandemic. But they're like, nah, still not worth anything. That was the junk card era where they just overproduced everything. But some people just love that collecting. Some people are like that it increases in value, that some of it
Hmm.
increases in value, and some people like that rarity, that scarcity element to say, hey, I own this bottle when it's super rare and hard to find and things like
It's
that, and I
true.
can show my friends and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was
I like
kind of
the
like
collection side of it
getting
as well.
into a concert or a bar before the person became famous. Like I just paid the cover charge to the bar to see whatever, bad example, but Celine Dion or whatever before she
Hmm.
hit Vegas. Sorry, Robert, what were you going to say?
Oh, the collection aspect's interesting. For me, it's like, can I get something that's obscure and interesting and hard
Ah,
to get and share it with other people that are
right.
like-minded, right? And so for me, it's more of a like I don't buy it just to let it sit there and appreciate and value. I buy it to and actually enjoy it with
Yeah.
other people.
And to share that with them an experience they might not find for themselves. That's a good aspect to it. Well, this is making me thirsty. I've got water, but you have wine. So to show me which bottles you both have with you today. Peter, what do you have there?
I have a 2013 Odero
Ah,
Barolo.
Rodero,
I
Barolo.
this I've made it easier for my sister to buy me birthday presents. So she buys me 3 bottles of this wine every year for my birthday,
My sister.
just to
Wow, that's
have.
great.
Yeah, so Barolo, as we talked about, was the wine that got me into wine, and so we tried a few different producers, and I really liked the Odera has a little bit more of a modern style, but still,
Okay.
the classicism I think of Barolo and the perfume that's out there, and the structure and ability to age for decades, which is always a good thing.
Awesome. And how would you describe it in terms of the aroma, this
Well,
smells
it's
that you're
got
getting?
the that floral, like almost potpourri kind
Mm,
of aromas, and the little bit of that tar. They say tar and roses for Barolo, so it has that
mm,
touch of earthiness to it as well, and a little bit of oak influence, so
yeah.
a touch of like toast and cedar, and then on the palate that just like sort of like melts because it's got a little bit of age to it, so it kind of melts into the mouth and into your saliva glands, right? Of that acid kind of kicking up, and Italian wines you almost always need to pair with food, right?
Yes.
As you're the expert on. So at 8:50 in the morning, it's actually
Breakfast of
tasting
champions.
pretty good after
Yeah.
brushing my teeth and everything. Yet it's still good. The mark of a great wine, right?
Yes, we'll have to pick breakfast cereals or something.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great. Which one do you have with you, Robert?
So I was just up in Sonoma yesterday for
Okay.
the weekend, and so I stopped and visited Rain, which is a relatively new producer, which is Carlo and
Carlo.
Dante Mondavi, who are the sons of Tim Mondavi. And
Oh, okay.
so
It's
this is
called
their
rain, as in the rain.
no RAEN. It's
Oh, okay.
Research in Agriculture of Enology Naturally. So that's what it stands for.
Okay.
Um, and so this is a Fort Ross Seaview, their Seafield Vineyard, really kind of maritime, well, not maritime, but really, right as the Pacific Ocean's coming, they have these little hills, and they're just above the fog line on one of those
Mm,
bluffs out there in northern Sonoma coast. So
nice.
super interesting producer. Like a lot of stem inclusion, but like these. I mean, what is this? Probably half out. Yeah, 12 and a half alcohol. Like really low alcohol. Really kind of different style of California Pinot Noir. And I like that they farming. I like that. I like that they it's they have a very specific point of view with their wines. And I think that it's there's a lot of things in California Pinot Noir that isn't great, and so it's always great to highlight the ones that are doing a good job.
Awesome. And what does it smell like to you?
Probably should. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I mean, so this so I definitely get like this like rose hip and rose stem floral notes from the stem inclusion. Definitely get a lot of kind of like ripe cranberry, red currant, sour
Mm,
cherry. It's very tart on the nose, red crunchy fruits. But a good floral, a little bit of earth spice in there as well. Then there's pretty low usage of oak as well, in terms of new
okay.
oak.
Oh, that sounds good. And Peter, back to you. Apart from breakfast, what would you pair your Barolo with?
Well, I think it could go with a very hearty pasta with like a sugo or ragu would go really well with it, or
Okay.
it's like a braised meat, like an ossobuco
Mm,
or something. I think would go really well. Something with a little fat to cut all the tannin and acid.
Right.
and
Right.
then meld with those slight floral, herbal, and earthy notes. I think that those would be pretty good pairings.
That sounds great. Robert, what would you put that Pinot Noir with?
Yeah, I'm not hung up on pairings, but I definitely think this could go. I mean, something like what Peter had mentioned would be way too heavy for this wine. I think it would overpower
Sure.
it. Definitely more. I think you go with things like pork or like roast chicken, like like pork just depends on how you cook them and what kind of things. Um, I think that pork loin and those things would go well. I think
Mm,
some heavy fish dishes could go well as well, or lighter pastas could go as well. But in
okay.
something that's, I think this would, because it has such good a little bit of fat, this acidity helps cut through that and kind of like adds almost as like anything you'd put like cranberry sauce with, or like
Duck.
you'd add this one instead. Duck would work as well.
Nice. Oh, that's great. Wow. I know what I'm having for breakfast.
Duck and ossobuco.
Yeah, exactly. Get the day started right. So you both have gadgets because I love to learn about new gadgets. Peter, let's start with the one that you have. Tell us about it and why you like it.
So this is a repour. It's
Okay.
a little stopper that just goes into the bottle. And as a wine student, I, need to keep a lot of wines open and just taste them, and so I need to keep them fresh. And so this works for a single bottle theoretically, although it has the capacity, I think, to absorb 2 liters of air. And what
Okay.
basically, those like little sachets in different food packages that absorb oxygen. There's
Yeah.
basically one of those inside here. It's
Okay.
more complicated than that, I think.
Okay.
There's It's basically how it works. And so you just stick it in after you open the bottle and it'll absorb the oxygen and keep
Huh.
your wine fresh for weeks or months. And so it's
Oh, wow.
designed to at least take like 5 glasses out. And so especially for, I have to keep a wide range of wines open, and so especially for screw caps or plastic corks or other things where like because sometimes I'll use a Corvin as well.
Hmm.
I think the repour works really well.
Wow. And is it reusable, like on multiple
This
bottles?
version is not. I think he's working
Okay.
on one that is, but it is made from recyclable materials, and they have a recycling program where you can send it back, like those Nespresso little capsules that you could
Yep.
send back. Yeah,
Oh,
and
wow. And
technically you could use it because it does have, depending on how you drink the wine, you could use it on multiple bottles, but then you'd have to like track, how much oxygen it's absorbed.
sure. And how much are they approximately?
I think they're about between $1 and $2,
Oh,
depending
okay.
on how many you buy. And
Sure. Oh, that's cool. And how would you compare its effectiveness with, say, a preserve spray if you've tried sprays?
I think these work much, much better.
Hmm.
The only difference with the preserve spray, the one thing that sometimes is challenging is that, so it's got these little like ridges that stick in, and so
Hmm.
sometimes if there's CO2 or something else in the wine, the things will like kind of pop out.
Oh,
So he said to like kind of like screw it in almost.
yeah.
But the preserve sprays work okay, but the problem is you're putting argon in and then trying to close it back, and that in that process of closing it back, air can come in, and so that
Huh.
can potentially, you know, damage the wine and not work that well.
It only gets the surface
Interesting.
oxygen too, right? Only displaces the surface,
Yeah.
like there's the oxygen that's then kind of bound with the wine,
That's
right?
that's
That's really
that's a
cool.
good point. That's the other thing too. Like, because this scavenges the oxygen, there's dissolved oxygen in the wine, and so
Ah,
Robert's point of it, it's only getting the oxygen on the surface, but this can actually absorb. Sometimes this works too well, and the wine becomes a little reductive, and you need to open it up
ah,
after you
right.
preserve it. And normally, after you open it up, you can hear like a little pop sometimes from
Yeah.
that suction in there, and because
Okay.
it'll scavenge the oxygen that's even dissolved in the wine as well.
Cool. That's great. I need to try that. I haven't tried those, so thank you for showing me that. And Robert, what do you have?
I have the Durand corkscrew opener. So
Okay.
it's basically obviously standard kind of like corkscrew helix and an so but a collector, I think in the South, in the US, basically patented this device and put them two together. And so for an old bottle, and I can kind of for an old bottle, you can, which is, you really only want to use this if you're drinking something that's 20 plus years old. So I typically use it on things that are like 30 years old or older. So if you're a restaurant and you have old wine on the list or opening old wine for people, like these are great to have. Obviously, you open old wines with a regular corkscrew, just an ASO, but sometimes it kind of like solves the problems that both of them have. So, when you're putting the helix into an old bottle and you start to pull,
Yeah.
a lot of times it's the cork so soft that you shred the cork.
Yes.
And then with the ASO, sometimes the cork is so loose that when you try to slide it on the side, it punches it in. And so
Okay.
you put this in and it stabilizes it, and then you put this in as a cross. And the real thing is, like, because you could do this with you can actually do something like this, and I've done this in the past before I own this.
Me too, yeah.
You can use like a regular waiter's corkscrew and then put the ASO on top of it. The problem is that you have a lot of gap. Usually the cork's
Okay.
up to about here, and therefore
Right.
good grip on those older, longer corks. And this helps remove really old corks from bottles. And like weeks ago, I opened probably like about 20 old bottles with some friends, and our oldest bottle was 1937, and we pulled that out, and so we pulled out a bunch of old bottles, 61, 49, and those everything came out with this. I've had a couple times where the cork was just so gone that it was nothing was going to save it. Except for you probably should have used port tongs to. But it is, if you like and drink older wines, again 25 plus years old, it's worth the investment because it is not cheap. It's around $5, I think, in the US.
I
$125.
think
Wow.
so, yeah.
At least it's reusable. But would it work? Would it work on just dried corks of wines that aren't necessarily old? Like, would it be useful for that as well?
I
Yeah,
mean, sure.
I use it for corks that I break. So like you
Okay.
break it in half and there's like that little nub or
Yeah,
half
that little
a
stub.
cork in.
Yeah.
It works really well for that too. I
Yeah.
actually use it much more broadly. I use it usually when it's 10 plus years old.
Okay. Ah,
I use an
gonna have to
ASO a
get one of
lot. Like
those.
I prefer the ASO over
Mm.
a helix in general. So
Huh.
I that works fine for me for from the 15 years old.
Well, I've got two things for my shopping list. All right. Thank you both for those. That's great. So as we wrap up, this has been fabulous. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to mention?
No, this was
Nope, we've
great.
covered it all. Okay.
Yeah, check out our podcast XChateau. We love.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Please tell us where we can find you. Now, podcast listeners, look for XChateau, X with the chateau. But where can we find you online for your website and so on?
Sure. So .com is the, and then I'm searching that on podcast looking there. And on Instagram we have X_chateau for our user account there, and then my personal is at Wine Terroir or wineterroir.com. Also Wine Terroir on YouTube.
Okay.
And XChateau has a LinkedIn account that I manage as well. So that since it's a business podcast, it makes sense that we're on LinkedIn as well.
Cool. That's great. Well, Peter, Robert, thank you so much for this. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Same.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. Bye for now.